Hello, all the listeners. This is Professor Masudul Choudhury, once again recording an additional YouTube lecture, very brief though. Before I went away for a break, I mentioned to you about a superstructure of how Tawhid as a law of monotheism becomes a scientific reality in our practical, conceptual firstly, and practical investigations. I'm going to show you now, bring forth to you two examples. Firstly, you will recall that I mentioned that events happen in the usual kind of scientific venture or thinking in the space-time, and that the space-time structure forms permanent nature of all scientific inquiry. And then I said, contrary to that, the science, or what I usually call now as a project as meta-science, but not to include metaphysical um, uh, fuzziness in it, rather to bring it to life, to experience, to reality, and through a methodological process, through methods that form the foundations of its ontology, its epistemology, its formalism, its methods in the form of models, its empirical dimensions, and its applications. So I said this to you as a contrast between the two kinds of scientific inquiry that we do. Now I'm going to represent in this diagram a non-Cartesian space. And let us say that this is that fuzzy space that you are talking about as a non-Cartesian. Non-Cartesian, why? Because, truly speaking, a meta-scientific inquiry cannot be contained within the two dimensions of time and space, nor can it be represented by any number of additional dimensions that represent Cartesian coordinates. These are conceptual domains of three kinds of things, three kinds of dimensions in which any event, and let us call an event to be E. This event takes place. And this event is therefore within a domain. And this domain, although I have to show it in the form that I'm showing it, but it is non-Cartesian, so it doesn't have those coordinates that we usually represent in any kind of scientific or social science investigations. This E is a coordinate, fuzzy, non-Cartesian coordinate made up of three dimensions. First is the knowledge dimension, which I represent by theta, and then there is a space dimension, and let's represent it with S, and that space dimension is embedded with theta, and in a moment I will explain to you why. And then there is time, T, which again is embedded in a certain knowledge premise, which is theta. And each of these theta, there is no one value of theta, there are other kinds of points which are events along it. But whenever there is an event, let's say this is E1 is an event, there is an event E2, and in between the two event E1 and E2, there is a circular causality. That is, the elements of these events, the things that we are inquiring about, they are interrelated to circular causation relation, which I mentioned to you earlier. And this theta is derived. It is derived as the representation of the law of oneness, which is Tawhid, taken from the premise of Tawhid. And the premise of Tawhid is represented by two cardinal elements. Omega, and please do not mistake this S with this S, but S is a mapping. is a mapping that takes the elements of omega, that is, every one of them is real in ontology, explaining the primal ontology of the oneness of God, working out itself as a law in the order and scheme of things. And S is therefore that mapping. In Islamic terminology, S is said to be the Sunnah. That is a teaching of the Prophet as a kind of a mapping that takes all the elements of the Quran, omega, through the Sunnah S, and brings it into life, theta, and theta therefore acquires a derived knowledge, which again goes through a discursive. This goes through a discursive process. So we have got an element in this space, which is described by all our points, which are events, and each event is of the three-dimensional nature, and whenever there is an event, there is yet another event, and all of these events are interrelated with one another. So that is therefore an interrelationship of the following type. And if you take multiple functional expansions of this, through functional expansion of this by other kinds of monotonic, that is, such an increasing functional relationship, then this F reproduces that relationship of A and B and C. So it reproduces that relationship, causing it to move in the following fashion. So inside this is the function, or the result of the function F. F itself is a monotonic increasing function that takes events and explains its meaning, its applications through an interrelated domain. This is the domain that I've shown here. Now, if you apply to this kind of thing, this kind of domain, choices, as you know, economics is the study fundamentally, firstly, is a study of choice. But the usual kind of economics that we always study, contrary to what should be, but may not be seemingly so, but what should be apparently the true nature of Islamic economics, is the fact that these events that you have, that I've shown you, these kinds of these events, they are all choices, and these choices are determined by your preferences, by individual, by social preferences. And let me say that social preference is denoted by rho. Therefore, rho is a kind of a relationship that we denote mathematically to denote our preferences for an event, or those events which are choices happening in a dimension that is of the nature that I've explained to you. Is rho E. And this rho E, every event here is embedded by a consciousness, theta. Therefore, if you want to go in, and think about a market that is an appropriate market, then of course you're talking about buying in this market not anything but certain socially good things, which are good for the self, individual, as well as for society as a whole. So, as an antidote to that is that smoking kills health. So smoking and similar kinds of unnecessary things in society should not be really consumed, and therefore the choice should be such that our preferences are formed by a certain consciousness in us to avoid such kinds of things, and the event space therefore get filtered by the acceptance of those kinds of things that are contrary to things that are that are harmful or non-beneficial to society and to individual as a whole. This is for the role. Now, you as an individual or a household member choose such things. And when we choose such things collectively, of course, we do not add up to society. Society is not additive, but it is aggregative. And therefore, this road that you have, this is the preference of the individual or the household. It is aggregated. I'm not going to write down cluttered forms of mathematical symbols here, but just to say that this is aggregated. Therefore, the preference that you derive is such a preference that is good for you, that is self, as well as being so, it collectively and discursively joins in with the rest of society out of discourse to create a selectivity of goods. Markets then become, therefore, markets become ethically embodied by knowledge, that is data. And the whole of the event space here, therefore, is an event space that you have there collected along with that many other such kinds of spaces that evolve because of this functional relationship. And all of these are therefore monotonic, expansionary, monotonic continuity of transformations of one good thing into higher levels of good things. And the Quran brings these things out in a very clear way, such as, for instance, the ayat that you can read in the Quran about the goodly tree and the goodly word, and the evil tree and the evil word, which are the two contrasting modes of social behavior, of individual behavior and collective behavior, aggregative behavior. So this is one of the things, therefore, which really, therefore, what is the nature of rho? Rho is induced by theta, and this theta is learning. It comes out of a learning space, an evolutionary learning space, based on the Quran and the Sunnah, on the foundation of the epistemology of the oneness of Allah, that is the episteme of the unity of knowledge. So rho is induced by theta, and since theta is dynamic in form, therefore rho is dynamic. This is a critical difference that we make between the way that preferences and choices are construed in the case of the usual kind of economic thinking, and in this kind of knowledge-induced world of events being made up of knowledge to the space in which things happen and time over which things happen, but time is a recorder. It is not a fundamental actor of anything. Thus, rho becomes a dynamic process. It's a dynamic process of really forming society in which I as an individual exist in connection, in discursively related to all others in society for the choices of the good things of life. And in Islamic literature, these good things of life are put into a basket, and this basket really is made up of three very fundamental kinds of goods, which again acquire their own dynamic forms. And they are, one, the needs of life, the second are the comforts of life, and the third are the refinements of life. They all together belong to the life fulfillment needs basket and create dynamic forms, as we see in the scale of evolutionary, in the evolutionary context. Therefore, the coming about, empirically derived coming about of the dynamic preferences makes a great and singular difference between how we conceive about preferences as datum in the usual kind of economic theory, and how it is construed in this particular case to endow this whole thing into a dynamic learning evolutionary form and bring all the other elements of it into cogent together, that is to say, interconnected with each other. So this is the one of the examples that I have wanted to point out to you as a very important example. And out of this example, as you keep on working as a student, as an inquirer, and you will find great differences will come about out of these kinds of display of ideas from the episteme of unity of knowledge, and the way we have learned economics as a static kind of analysis, and dynamic only in a thing that we say is not really the creator of anything. that is time. Rather, knowledge is the creator. But this is what has been dispensed away with in the usual form of economic thinking. Okay, this is the end of the second, the last two lectures that I have given today, and I will proceed on with a third example.